Hello everyone! In today's video, I get the interior and body mounted to the chassis and install the drivetrain onto the 83 Camaro project, and I also design and print a custom roll cage for the Firebird. I've been continuing to make progress on the AMT 1/25th scale Camaro build. In the previous video, I mainly focused on the electronics. With that now complete, I moved on to figuring out how I was going to mount the body and the interior to the chassis, as well as mock everything up and ensure there are no clearance issues. The first thing I did was remove the servo and torque arm chassis mount from the chassis. As you may recall from the previous video, the N20 motor that I'll be using for this car requires mounting holes that are not on this older version of the chassis, so I printed a new one. I used a 1.5mm drill to ensure that all of the holes would be the correct size. I also used sandpaper to remove any rough sections from the chassis, and I ensured that the front suspension assembly will fit. I will be painting the chassis flat black. I also sanded around where the over axle piece will be secured to the rest of the chassis, and I then mounted it to the main chassis piece. I mounted the wheels and tires that I'll be using to a 53mm MA10 axle and began mocking everything up. I'm using wheels that are 10mm wide, which is larger than the wheels that are included with the kit, and I was a bit concerned about how much clearance there would be. It looks like everything will fit okay, but just barely, especially if I decide to go with the lower ride height. In an effort to try and get every millimeter of clearance that I could, I decided to quickly use a rotary tool to remove some material from both the wheel well section of the interior tub and the body. I marked where I wanted to remove material from, and then carefully used a rotary tool with a small bit to grind away as much material as I could without breaking through. I was able to hold the part up to a light, which made the sections I was working on slightly transparent enough to see how thin they were. This of course isn't going to make any drastic increase in space, but it should help to eliminate the possibility of any rubbing, as well as gives me the option to drop the ride height pretty much as low as I want it to be. There were a few mold lines on the underside of the roof that I decided to quickly sand away. I did a quick mock-up and I'm really liking the look so far. I know the contrast of the white body and the black wheels doesn't show up great on camera, but in person this wheel design looks awesome with this body. I'm hoping to have the ride height set to something fairly similar to how it is here. One thing I noticed is that this edge here is going to limit how low I can have the front of the car sit, as well as it could become an issue while steering, so I decided to remove it. Not only does this clear up some space, but I also like the look of it much better now that these sections are removed. I wanted to start thinking about how I was going to mount the body and the interior to the chassis. I'll probably be securing the interior to the body either using tape or glue, or I might come up with some more creative way of doing it. So I only need to decide how I want to secure the interior tub to the chassis, which won't be too difficult since it sits right on top of it. To secure the rear section, I decided to use magnets. However, I probably won't end up using them since the screws that I installed a little later on seem to be sufficient in keeping the interior and body secure, making this magnetic mount unnecessary, but it's still an option. To make the screw holes which will secure the interior tub, I held the chassis in position and drilled 2 small holes up through the interior. I made sure that these holes will be under where the front seats will be so that they won't be visible. I increased the size of the holes after making the initial one, and I made sure that the holes on the chassis are even larger to allow for some adjustability. Just with these 2 fasteners, the interior feels solid, so I think these are the only mounts that I'll need. Since I'm using 2 machine screws that are threaded into nuts, I glued the nuts into position so that they won't move. At this point, I hadn't yet checked whether or not the N20 motor and gear assembly would have any clearance issues with the interior, so I quickly mocked everything up to get an idea of how it would fit. Although it looks like it will be close, so far everything is looking good. I needed to install the rest of the drivetrain in order to know for sure how everything would fit. So I moved on to assembling this 53mm MA10 axle assembly that I'll be using with this car. Although eventually I do plan on installing a limited slip differential, for now I'm just going to stick with this locked rear end setup like I'm currently using on the Mustang, since I'm still experimenting with the differential, and for now I just want something that works. With the axle assembly looking good and rotating smoothly, I installed the torque arm mount since that is the suspension setup that I'll be using with this car. I then installed the trailing arms and the panhard bar. With the suspension links mounted, I was ready to secure them to the chassis, but before I could do so, I noticed that I had the wrong size main chassis piece. This one is designed for 57mm axle assemblies, not the 53mm that I'm using. I got a new main chassis piece that is the correct size and is for a 53mm MA10 axle. I drilled the holes and sanded it just like I did previously, and then I mounted the rear axle and over axle piece. After confirming that the rear axle can move smoothly, I next figured out how long I needed to cut a piece of 1.5mm steel rod for the torque arm. I got everything into position the best that I could and marked where I wanted to make the cut. I grinded it down a little to get to the exact length, and then I installed it. I basically repeated the same process to cut a section of 2mm steel rod for the drive shaft. Like I've said before when making drive shafts, make sure that it is not too long, which may result in it binding when the rear suspension moves. I also installed the motor and once again verified that everything can move smoothly. Now I wanted to figure out if there were any clearance issues with the interior tub and the drivetrain. Although I thought for sure that I would need to make some modifications, it turned out that everything fit. I ended up creating a sort of slot in the chassis so that I would have a lot of adjustability when positioning the body. I tested all of the electronics once again and ran the motor for the first time. This motor runs pretty smooth at low speeds, and it's a lot more tame than the RF130CH I'm using in the Mustang. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the car performs with this motor, since it's looking like this motor will provide the more scale performance that I'm interested in. With this complete, I can now move on to finishing the chassis by installing the front suspension assembly and getting all of the electronics mounted, and I can begin to paint the car and take it for a test drive, which I'm definitely looking forward to doing. This past week, I had a chance to begin working on the interior for the 1/24 scale 91 Firebird. I wanted to start by making a roll cage, which I thought would make a great addition to the interior. Although in the past for making roll cages, I've used the 3D scan of a body to aid in the design process, for this I wanted to keep it more simple and make it easier for somebody without access to a 3D scanner to follow along. I started by simply taking a couple of photos of the body from the side and top, and took some measurements. I then positioned the images as canvases within Fusion 360, and I then scaled them to the correct size and began modeling the roll cage. I sketched the design that I wanted and then converted the sketch lines into pipes. Once I was satisfied with the design, I printed out the cage using an FDM printer with PLA filament, just for the purpose of mocking things up and seeing how it fits. The final cage will be printed using an SLA printer. Although this process is simple and doesn't require any scanning equipment, the downside is, unless you're diligently taking measurements and really making an effort to ensure that it will fit, you will likely have to make a few versions with some design tweaks before you'll have a roll cage that fits. Due to the print settings I was using and the part being relatively fragile, I ended up breaking a few sections while removing the support material, which I simply glued back together. Despite it being a little rough, I really like the design. But the big question is whether or not it will fit. I ended up getting lucky with this cage and it fit like a glove. I just needed to trim down the lower legs until it sits at the right height. I think the cage really adds a lot to the interior. If there is a way to easily remove the rear seats without leaving a giant hole, I would definitely do that, but since I don't want to mess around with the interior too much, I'm just going to leave it as it is. I will, however, be adding some racing seats as well as a different steering wheel, and I'd like to try to modify the dash as well. Be sure to let me know any of your ideas or suggestions for the interior below in the comments. I'm also tempted to scale down this cage a bit and add one to the Camaro as well, since I figured it would probably fit just as long as it was a little smaller, but I'm not sure whether or not I want to add a roll cage to that build. I might mock one up and see how I like it. To conclude today's video, I want to showcase some of the awesome projects and vehicles that have been showcased over on the Make It RC Facebook group. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.